My name is Fernando Vasconcellos, and I'm an AI director at Valuation Consulting. And together with my colleague today, Kelvin King, I'll be describing how can you actually unlock value of your intangible assets and better drive decision making, particularly for return on investment of these assets. So I really wanted to start the presentation today by asking the following question. What would the world look like? Or imagine if the world today had no intangible assets. What would it look like? All of the things that we use, that we're accustomed today, that we know of, and that are largely based on intangible assets, and that we use on a day-to-day basis, how would that look like? So how about if we didn't have the internet, for instance? All the intangible assets that went into developing the internet. That would take us back to 1991, when it was first developed by Tim Berners-Lee. Going back a little bit further to the 1980s and the development of personal computing, which was not available until that time, and the usage and really the ownership of electronic data, which really became more mainstream. And we'd be looking like this gal. If we go a little bit further into the 1940s, we had the development of the first programmable electronic computer, known as the Colossus, and the software associated with it. So this was developed by Alan Turing, who actually formalized the logic behind this, and by the engineer Tommy Flowers that built the computer to really crack the Enigma machine during World War II. So this was actually was pivotal in the development of software. Another interesting fact is that if you think about the idea that humans had in the past, it was actually Francis Bacon in 1623 that actually stated that you could actually use two symbols, or in this case, ones and zeros, to sufficiently encode all communication. So that was quite extraordinary. If we go back a little bit further in the 1870s and we think about brands, how was life without brands? So here I have a presentation of the Bass brand, which was the first registered brand in the world in 1876. So imagine ourselves in this era with smoking jackets. By the way, the Bass brand is still used today and it's still accruing value. So that's a very important lesson. If we go back even a bit further and look into the 1450s and in Venice, for instance, and they had the glass makers that had their proprietary process, their intellectual property and patents actually, which were first developed then to protect the meticulous and intricate glasswork and methods that they were using during this 15th century. So here we have also an example of fine and intricate the glass piece dating from this time. And if we want to go way, way back, I mean, humans have always been extremely creative. And another example that we can use is humans have also developed brands so that they could protect, safeguard their livestock and actually, be able to protect them in the best way possible. Now, I really wanted to kick off the start of the main part of the talk by focusing on the main point of enterprise value. Now, enterprise value can be separated into different parts. The first being tangible assets, and that we know, which are buildings, offices, etc. And then we also have intangible assets. And intangible assets, they can be either disclosed intangible assets or undisclosed intangible assets. So as the name indicates, disclosed are intangible assets that are registered in the company's books. Now, undisclosed intangible assets are the lump of all the other intangible assets which are critically important for a company, but that sometimes get turned into goodwill. So it's really important actually to understand all these pieces. How do these assets play out, and what is the true enterprise value of companies? Now, in today's world, brands and intangible assets are really leading the way for innovative and companies that are really forging the way. So if we look on the part chart on the left, we notice that 52% of all enterprise value of the PLCs, which is public limited companies, they're attributed to intangible assets. Now this is extraordinary. The other thing that we have to know is more and more so in this data-driven, brand-led economy as well, and knowledge-based economy, companies are more and more intangible. And some companies, software companies and other ones that are quite innovative, can actually have the percentage of their value up to 90% being intangible assets. Now it's extremely important then for the entire organization, boardrooms, investors, stakeholders, everyone to really understand this so that they can actually protect their assets well, first identify them, then know how to best structure their assets, the position, as will be described by our colleagues, but then actually maximize the monetization that could be done. Some other examples here that we like to point out is that there are certain companies in which their brand value actually exceeds their book value. Now, the definition of a book value is exactly how it's stated here. It's the value on the books or the accounts or the financial statements, which are the total amount of assets minus the total liabilities for a company. Now, this is not to be confused with the market value, because that could be, that's more towards the stock market or marketplace. So when you have a market value. But what's really interesting here is as companies need to use their brand in order to get ahead and to promote themselves, even if they run into difficulty, they can actually start up again. As you'll see from the examples, Coca-Cola, their brand is 3.7 times the book value of the company. And there's other ones like Amazon at 2.4 and Apple has 2. I mean, it goes on. And I would stress that most small and medium-sized companies, this could also be the case. As long as the assets are protected adequately, they have tremendous, tremendous value. So what if you suddenly discovered a dusty painting in your attic and then you suddenly realized that it was a Rembrandt? Would you treat it differently? So what would you be able to do with that? So similarly, if you know the true value of your intangible assets, you really can try to start taking better care of them, you can protect them, and you can know how to best leverage them in the best possible way. Now, one of the other main points that I wanted to point out to everyone is most financial, business, and investment decisions, they really rely on 2 main factors. So the first one is valuation. So valuation can be difficult at times, but there's different scenarios, but that's the starting point for making any kind of management decision. Once the value is determined, then the decision-making process becomes a little bit easier. So you have to really understand your assets, value them in the best way possible, and we'll describe methods to do that in order to have the best kind of management and also return on your investments. The other thing that I want to really point out is valuation is not an exact science. It's an art and a science, and it really involves determining the value of an asset, but based on that, you use it as a negotiation tool. It supports business decisions. So the story that you have that goes along with the business plan and the financial projections, I mean, these are all forecasts. There's some uncertainty related to that. But that needs to be very, very well, joined up with the story and the financials and the valuation and the risks in the company. That way, you're able to look at what's important, what's not important, and then have a better discussion and then make more informed business and investment decisions. Now, what are some of the key methods that are used? There's many ways of doing this, but there's well accepted and international standards which we at VC use. So broadly, they're within 3 categories. The first one is the cost approach, which would basically be the cost to replace the functionality of an asset and perhaps discounted for obsolescence. Now, this could be very, very useful in determining how much investment has been put into an asset and what funds have been allocated as such. And for you to also understand is, as things progress, what is the return in terms of cash flows or clients that you're winning that are coming from those assets. It also gives you a very good understanding of the baseline cost or the baseline value of your assets. The second one, which is critically important as well, and it has to do a lot with what we do, is the market-based approach. Now here, we're looking at the market for a lot of comparator information, so we support all the valuations based on information that's in the market, that's benchmarked. And for this instance, we can also see what was the investment received for an equity stake in the company. Perhaps we'll look at royalty rates, which are absolutely critically important for determining licensing agreements. Or we could look at enterprise earnings ratios or the EV/EBITDA multiples, or perhaps the price earnings or PE ratios, in determining some of these factors that play a role in determining the value of the asset. So again, all of these things are absolutely critical in determining the baseline and the numbers that will go into the modeling. Now, the last one, which is I think the one that we most base our valuations on, would be the future income approach. And we use bespoke financial models to calculate this. And effectively, we use the definition of an asset for this. And The definition of an asset we think of as a series of future cash flows. So those cash flows can be positive, they can be negative, and they can also be, future benefits for the company or an individual. But essentially, it's a future of cash flows that you would be able to calculate the net present value today and determine the valuation for that. I think the other thing that we at VC use is we try to take a holistic approach. We look at all the three methods, we compare them, and we stress test them. We look at the risks, we stress test financials, we look at the business plans. So based on that, experience as well is absolutely critical. So experience, insight, and independence is everything that we bring towards the work that we do. Now, I think this is one of the main points that we want to drive in this kickoff session, is that valuation really enables the monitoring on return on investment. So if you are able to identify your brands, let's say, and protect them early enough, you'll start accruing value from that day on forwards. You'll be able to then look at the marketing spends also and investments that you're making in this, so that you can year on year monitor what is the return on investment and then make the necessary decisions. Should we do one project versus another? You can do the valuation for both and then pick the one that has a larger value. So using brand to raise equity and debt is also critical in these times. And my colleague Kelvin has extremely interesting examples that will tie into this. That will explain how it's done in practice. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that you can use this as a key performance indicator of your brand value and how that's contributed to your return on investment as you plan to drive the company forward. So that will help you on the structuring and etc. So I think with that, I'm going to pass the word to my colleague Kelvin, who will describe several very interesting examples of how we do this in practice and how we use international standards for obtaining the valuation, but then helping companies obtain the return on investment that they need so much.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Great stuff. Let me just share live video. Once upon a time, I set up Valuation Consulting about 30 years ago, left government and treasury, and I found a wonderful office in the Hop Exchange next to Borough Market. Fine purveyors of fine foods. Within a few years, we ran out of space in the Hop Exchange. So I was talking to the office manager and I said, have you got any space? We love the Hop Exchange. I like where I am. And he said, well, Mr. King, let's show you downstairs. And any of you that don't know the Hop Exchange, it is what it says it is. It was the Hop Exchange in the old days, and they stored the hops in the basement, and huge basement area with fantastic open spaces down there. Anyway, office manager took me downstairs, and he showed me, well, this could be ideal for you. And it was a very large padded room, hugely padded room. And I said, yeah, this space is absolutely ideal, but I'm not quite sure about the environment and what my HR colleagues would take it if I started to move folk down into a rather large padded cell. Not what you think, Mr. King. This is where Iron Maiden used to practice in the days gone by. Next. And reading a little article about Merck Mercuriadis a couple of weeks ago in the Sunday Times reminded me so much of that experience and that interesting, insightful time of viewing where Iron Maiden in the early days were practicing. Of course, Merck, as well as many others, Elton John, a string load of incredible managerships of bands. And he's been well known constantly for looking at the opportunity to securitize music and music copyright and good big brands in the music sector. And a couple of weeks ago, his Hypnosis Songs Fund, upon which I believe on the board sit luminaries like Nile Rodgers, were raising 500 million. That was in 2019. 2019 also illustrated quite a few successful raises, and a couple of weeks ago, he was predicting in 2 years to be up to £2 billion on the securitization of music copyright. And of course, it comes as no surprise, I guess, to many of us with all the streaming that's going on at the moment. Next. This is usual stuff. If you go back to 1997, the Bowie bonds had a little bit of up and down, the history. 1999, there's a chap there. the #1 soul brother, as described, James Brown. He has a great history of fabulous songs and fabulous securitization. And those two on the right, many of you, not quite my vintage, would struggle with these two if you didn't struggle with James Brown. Ashford and Simpson, well known, and a beautiful story. They met in one of the, I think it's a White Rock Baptist Gospel Choir in New York, or wherever it was, around about Manhattan. And the rest, as they say, is pretty much history. Some of the most classic songs they've penned, notably There Ain't No Mountain High Enough, covered most latterly or credited by Amy Winehouse in that wonderful track, Tears Don't Dry, or something like that, if I recall. And Whitney Houston was covering I'm Every Woman. Again, a fabulous securitization of music rights and intellectual property. So at the moment, we're seeing there is track record. There is, as Fernando described, the ability to see a market purely on IP securitization. What are we coming along next? Big brands coming in. Dunkin' Donuts, Baskin Robbins, 1.7 billion, 2006. Royalty Pharma, a more difficult securitization of intellectual property rights, one may think. Patents, technical IP in the pharma sector, it's been done. Poor Capital, that was all life sciences, another significant $228 bond issuance. Now, just let me draw your attention to the lines at the bottom. Each of these were given AAA ratings. For those of you that may not know, when there is such as bond issuances or offering generally in the marketplace, there's credit rating agencies such as Moody's and Fitch who give their opinion, hugely well researched, on the quality of the underlying assets that have been offered in often bond issuances or in structures. And look at that, all AAA. I hasten to add, right down at the bottom, you see on the ratings of very poor assets, the C's crop in, and even the defaults, the D's. So fabulous ratings by significant financial institutions of pure IP placings. Next. And again, this one really hit the headlines because many of us, at least over here in Europe, we are looking at this. Sears, 1.8 billion in 2006, a very clever structure. Moved Kenmore, Craftsman and Die Hard, brands that I'd never heard of. I quickly looked them up. Their most fabulous products in their stores. Put them into a bankruptcy remote vehicle, which was subsequently cleverly removed into a reinsurance vehicle in Bermuda. Strange but true, but really up in the high quality bond issuances at the time, and also touching on how to structure and how to protect these crown jewels in terms of getting them away from the dirty business of doing business. Rupert later will be talking far more about this, and it's a very clever trick because it increases value. Again, big brands there, Birdseye, secured against the brand, the pre-Nomad acquisition. Again, big figures, $300 million. Next. Now, this is what got the city sitting on the edges of their seat. Wonderful. White and Mackay. Brown Liquid, maturing whiskey in barrels. 188 million was securitized in this maturing whiskey. A little bit later, wonderful portfolio of brands, Marne and Champagne of France, including Veuve Clicquot, used 60 million bottles of pipeline bubbly to raise 242 million. Again, what better to get the eyes and the attentions of the city financiers? And of course, the most famous one probably of all, the Diageo, the 2.5 million barrels of maturing whiskey. Hey, but is that IP? Well, of course, these are significant brands. Nobody's going to securitize Kelvin's bubbly in the loft or wherever. It's the brands which are giving the marketplace confidence. But let's move back to the IP piece in terms of the more difficult areas to understand. Next, please. GKN, pure branding. Lindengruppen, a fascinating, fantastic Swedish company. Brands, Kolart, any of you who are artists? or dabble like I do will know coal arts and the art materials, but also they have significant specialist brands in coatings and such like. Brickvic, that was one of all their beverages, one where we worked on in Valuation Consulting, and also Chewy, again, first and third brands in the sector, Thompson and First Choice. Why these last two are particularly insightful, and I'll be focusing on in the coming slides, is that they were securitizations that had to be the most rigorous of all, because they were satisfying pension trustees in a zero risk environment. 1 week, the pension trustees were being offered cash to keep their pension liabilities right up to the requirements of the Pension Protection Fund. The next minute they were being offered bits of paper, some trademark registration. So how do you convince trustees, pension trustees, their actuaries, and in Chewy, I'm not giving anything away, 8 at the time, 8 different groups of pension trustees, all separately advised by their actuaries, pension advisors, lawyers, and accountants. How do we get to convincing that kind of roster of professionals and the company pension trustees that they're getting high quality assets that were as good as cash? Well, we can do it. It's been proved time and time again. Next, please. But it's hard work. Let me just move to a report I wrote a few years ago now, about 4 years ago. It was called Banking on IP for Government. Government was very rightly trying to encourage clearing banks, particularly relevant in today's climate, to lend and understand better companies which were only really running, as Fernando spoke about, on IP and intangibles. And part of that was interviewing, well, our current Bank of England governor, Andrew Bailey, and his colleagues in the Prudential Regulation Authority. Not the sort of interview you look forward to. Did my best. But one thing that fascinated me in that, because at that time, the banks were being really hammered by the Basel demands, the Basel 2, Basel 3, Basel 1, 2, 3, which demanded, following the first major financial crash in our histories, our lifetimes, the requirement that banks have better solvency. So they produced solvency ratios. So I said to Andrew and his team, I said, hey, a lot of these solvency ratios, I think I could help the clearing banks and I could help yourselves. Because at the moment, what I'm seeing is they're not allowed to count the most successful lending that they are doing quite often. And that's all intangible asset, IA. They all sort of went back in their seats. What the hell's this chap talking about? And I gave them an example, the Royal Bank of Scotland. To their immense credit in those days, they had a unit, if I recall, in Islington, who I helped out on a considerable number of occasions, purely specialising, solely specialising in lending on franchising. Well, what is franchising? As we know, KFCs, Hilton hotels, etc., etc. It's all branding. But yet nobody wanted to acknowledge or look and see and understand that this was an incredibly successful track record, which is what everybody wants to see, of lending with pure IP, intangible asset, quality as a backing, and hardly any defaulting, as I can recall. Unfortunately, that unit, the franchising unit, was abandoned by RBS some time ago. But I did bring that to mind. I don't think I changed the requirements of the Prudential Regulation Authority on solvency ratios, but I think I made a point and it was frustrating. Next. The big issue we have, and again, this is something for Rupert later, who will dwell on this, a lot of people, because there's been an awful lot in the press, of course, international tax structures, avoidance or evasion and such like, the words that I've seen bandied about. But let me tell you, there is no problem with these structures. They're entirely safe if they're done well. A few years ago, Roy Saunders, who established and runs to this day, good friend of mine, we're both building our businesses at the same time 30 years ago. He established, about the last 10 years, the International Business Structuring Association. It's worldwide and it consists of very sharp international tax brains, including his own, Mr. International Tax. Many would dig him in the ribs and he would smile, but it is true, stunning international tax mind. But he asked me to write quite a substantial newsletter for him about 4 years ago now, all about valuation and the issues to support these structures. So happy and content was Roy that bringing me into the frame in supporting how to do these international tax structures well by good valuation, arm's length valuation, good assessment of royalty rates. There was nothing wrong with these structures, and Roy effectively put a stamp on that in kindly inviting me to contribute to his very well-known newsletter. So done well. There's no international tax issues. And in fact, you know, the Irish government hung tooth and nail on the fact that they wanted to retain their 12.5% attractive rate for intellectual property holding companies, and you know, freedom of trade in the EU and all that kind of stuff. But brands typically are the primary asset in these structures. Why is that? Well, they're quite understandable for those who have trouble with intellectual property. You know, brand is in your face, even as I say in that Chewy instance where we had some very demanding, very suspicious pension trustees who could only deal with zero risk on behalf of their charges, and that's extreme fiduciary duty. You know, even they could understand that brands carry a lot of value. It was then getting them into a state of agreeing to the valuation process, and this is how it was done. Structuring helps considerably, and needless to say, whenever intangible assets are used, a structure where they're protected, or your crown jewels are protected, they're moved often into a group company and licensed from there, has so many value-added benefits. It's often purely for commercial reasons, the efficiencies. Anyway, Rupert will dwell more, as will Esther, on the power of those structures and licensing. Next, please. The suspicion that the marketplace has with intangible asset valuation. Well, how do you value? You know, I haven't quite got a crooked hat and a wand, Kelvin. No, it was drawn out by the accounting world's difficulty with these assets, and as Fernando underlined, their representation in financial reporting, which is pretty dire, even to this day. You know, Fernando had quite a nice brand name up a little bit earlier, a client of ours in times past, Coca-Cola. Their brand still, if you were Coca-Cola, you say, can go to your auditor, still couldn't go to your auditor and say, oh, that's quite valuable. Can we see this in our public balance sheet and accounts? Still can't do it to this day. But accounting did touch it slightly with acquisitions and commercial activity. But the problem that everybody has, and understandably, anybody could put their hand up and say they were a qualified intellectual property valuer. You know, company valuation is difficult enough, but people were doing this on the back of interest, or on interesting diversions from main activities. So I took my society into my Society of Sharing Business Values, which I founded moons ago, into the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors some time ago, because RICS, the only international body that accredits those who are worthy of accreditation in plant and machinery and real estate. Those of you that know finance and lending with real estate, if you don't have a red book valuation, you won't get your lending. It's on the checklist of the clearers and the main banks and debt houses. Have you got a red book valuation of your plant and machinery or your real estate? So this was frustrating, and we wanted intangible assets and business goodwill incorporated within the red book. To cut a long story short, the red book, 2 chapters I was considerably authored, are now in the red book. You can now be accredited as an intellectual property and business valuer. You can have a red book valuation of your intangible assets. And why is this comforting? It's because those standards and the stamp of an RICS accreditation has been well approved. And as I say, traditionally, God's word in real estate and plant and machinery, not quite God's word with IA yet, but it's becoming so, because, as I say, it's the successful track record which is important to illustrate. With the Chewy and Brickvic examples a little bit earlier, pension protection fund got a little bit shaky. What are these strange assets being used? And 2014, they produced a report. It took 18 months in the making. But to cut a long story short, PPF summarized their deliberations in terms of my interest by confirming that brands and IP are referenced as an appropriate asset class, i.e. high quality assets. The valuer who undertakes this work, thankfully, should be one who's accredited and who understands the difficulties and has been doing this, hopefully as a dedicated expert for some time, because I am still learning to this day, I can assure you. And the valuer needs to involve others, not work in a vacuum. Next. So how does he involve others? How do we get to this state of convincing debt houses, pension trustees, and all those other constituents, the clearing banks in this current disastrous environment where small companies, all they've got is their software, their brand, or their database, whatever it is. How do you get to the stage of you being able to use these in the Fernando's summary of valuation processes? It's a significant due diligence. We work with Julius and colleagues and the team to understand the nature of what we're valuing. And bear in mind, a brand very much is a bundle of rights. Lots of different assets, mostly IP, are in that bundle. So you need to work closely with your trademark, if you're valuing patents, the patent attorneys, the IP lawyers, to understand the strength, weakness, opportunity, threat of that subject asset. Valuers can't do it. I'm not trained to do it. But more than that, we need to talk to the scientists. We need to talk to, we're evaluating some new molecules in cancer research for a big American organization a couple of years back, and it was drawing upon the scientific expertise within and externally for an independent view before we in VC were happy to even touch this. You draw upon all of these necessary ingredients to make you as the valuer comfortable with the nature of the asset, its protection, its possible need for better protection, better enforcement later for Julius and Rupert and Esther, all those kind of things. So you can't pack us off. We've got to do a long due diligence process before we're even happy of getting to the modeling. So what do we do again when lending is difficult, or even bankers or debt houses are difficult with these assets, despite the fact, we've got some long track records going back many years as I've in this chat illustrated. Well, let's together identify the risk to apply. What kind of risks, Mr. Banker, Mr. Pension Trustee, would you consider reasonable? And I always remember Chewy, it's quite amusing. And he's not giving any privacy away. There was a rather large room in Linklaters consisting of all of those advisors, actuaries, and everybody else, solicitors and accountants, big four firms or whatever. So they're saying, okay, Kelvin, we listen to you and we understand going concern valuation. Yeah, going concern valuation, sort of thing Fernando was talking about earlier. But we don't want that. That's no good to us. We won't need the brand or the accompanying assets until there's some distress. Okay, I said, so this might bring, I know there's quite a few legal minds listening, a little smile. So I said, well, what do you mean by distress? And the room sort of just didn't take long, needless to say, these hugely bright minds. And the sum total of it was a few smiles around the room, not giving anything away. Let's come back to you in a few weeks on that, Kelvin. Well, I said, well, think about these. You've got forced sale. That might be rather unfair when we're talking about some of these large multinational companies with their significant layers to deflate risk. So, let's not imagine Armageddon, although when I was doing it, I remember one pension trustee, a volcanic ash, Kelvin. It was at the time of volcanic ash, and I can tell you, I do a bit of sub-back, or did in those days, and I was doing some diving in Sharm el-Sheikh in those days, and I was sitting in the departure lounge, and all I could see would be other people, as I'm a pretty much independent traveller, being looked after by the giants such as Chewy and Cosmos and all of those big carriers, and looking after their clients. And there was Jill and I, my wife, sitting there rather, in a significantly distressed state, not being so well looked after because we're independent travellers. The power of a brand, even in distress. Anyway, we got away from that. The professionals came back in a few weeks' time with a decent summary of what I should consider in my modelling. Let's go to the example, Fernando. I've got to say, this is not an example from the Chewy or Brickvic case. This is another iconic UK brand, not the largest, but one of the most iconic. I will remain nameless. But what we did here, we sat down with the company to look at the likely, again, rather like Chewy and Brickvic, for the stressed insolvency value, for want of a better description. What will we get if it all goes wrong? The negativity on the part of, particularly the heads of credit risk and the clearing banks. Well, it's going to go wrong, isn't it? So, okay, well, let's talk about if it's going to go wrong, and let's model the fair scenarios of the impact of that. So this is what we came up with in this case. I'm not going to run through these at great length. I just want you to focus on. So we're talking about probabilities. What is the probability? Let's pick up on that fifth one there. Sale of a business as going concern. Well, it's a bit too positive and optimistic for most, but we did give that a probability of 25% because it was very fair in this case. And look at the bottom there, to pander to the incredible conservatism and prudence, rightly so, the forced sell on a breakup basis, we gave that a probability of 35%. So you're not making this up. You're working with the lenders, the debt houses, the pension trustees, our actuaries, whoever it is, in whatever situation, to agree the types of risks that they consider is fairly appropriate for the subject matter, i.e. the brand, your subject brand. Next, please. So that's how we get it. And pretty much you're talking about a going concern value of, what is 100. And, on a reasonable distress basis, possibly you're knocking that back till about maybe around about the 30 mark. But that 30 or 40 mark is inevitably and nearly good enough to provide a solution for most problems. So even the distressed insolvency value is good enough to provide a solution for lending, for pension deficit solutions. And you should be putting these and thinking about them as in a structure. And this is really a follow through to what's going to be happening next. And bearing in mind when I mentioned Andrew Bailey and the franchising, licensing as reported, mega top 150 global licensors. I think the branding stuff is coming at it, 280 billion dollars or something. This is the marketplace. The marketplace illustrates this wonderful power of IA to raise money for those who are educated and can do proper valuation work. But the old place of contingent arrangements, legal charges, parent guarantees don't improve cash flow, negative impact for stakeholders and city analysts, gone. Direct asset funding doesn't increase value. Typically losing operational control of the assets is no good at all. Rupert is going to really focus on these ABCs and the power that they have to control the assets. So, in the pension environment, the company doesn't lose the power of using those brands. Thompson, the first choice, they are licensed back to the company. And for those of you that may have thought about a very clever question, I'm going to not let you stew on it, but answer it straight away, that in the event of, let's say, somebody coming along wanting to buy Chewy or whatever, or Brickvic, they have the power to buy back whatever was used, those brands, out of the structure at fair market value at the time. So the company never lose. It's win-win-win. Thank you very much.
Absolutely wonderful stuff there. Thank you so much, Kelvin. Fernando, if I could perhaps just ask you to stop sharing your screen. We'll get both of you back on there. Now, we've had a few questions come in there as well. What I want to do is just to make sure that we cover as much as possible, but we're also a little bit neat for time. We had a comment saying from Eric, actually, saying it was a great question about transfer pricing and tax issues. Rupert will actually address this directly in this session, so we'll look to cover off that particular question at this stage. Kel is saying, you've given some great examples of IP securitization. In your view, why hasn't lending on IP become more widespread in the last 10 years? Kelvin, would you like to take that initially?
Traditional banking, again, we're seeing it in the current crisis, and everybody is going onto the chat rooms locally and complaining that our banks aren't listening. The big problem is this, that the bankers traditionally, debt houses, will look at reasonably cleverly, you might think, cash flow lending. What is the cash flow? But what they're not doing is going a step further in asking what is driving the cash flow, what actually is making this cash flow tick. And if they just went to that extra question and asked that due diligence in the process of talking to clients, well, it's our database, it's our software, it's our branding, it's our technology, that we would start to think about, or the bankers and those that are lending would start to think about, well, the quality of the cash flow. So looking at the cash flow on its own, which they traditionally do, without asking the extra question of why this cash flow is there, how it's likely to improve in the future, and how steady and safe it is because of the quality of the intangible assets, they traditionally don't go that far, and they don't understand there is a marketplace for intellectual property and intellectual capital. Fernando?
I agree 100% with what you said, Kelvin, as well. And to add to that, absolutely true. If you have, let's say, a software asset that's been licensed and you can very closely track the cash flows associated with this software asset and show where it's coming from, jurisdictions or asset type, that becomes a lot easier to then, convince lenders to lend against those assets. Similarly, I think Kelvin gave an excellent example on franchises. More and more companies are trying to break through the complicated situation now, and they have to differentiate themselves at maximally. So I think having the assets and used in that fashion helps considerably, I think, raising the funds. The other thing that I think that Kelvin and I were talking about a little bit earlier was you can use this also to issue growth shares to incentivize management, which is excellent as well. So it's the proprietary know-how of the company, everyone's knowledge that is within the company's rights to maintain, and the AI assets, let's say, in the brands, they're all within this mix that then managers and other executives or everyone in the company can actually buy a part of the company and be part of this. So this is another way of essentially lending against AI assets.
And can I butt in again? I want to get rid of this nonsense that intangible assets are, it's the new industry. Intangible assets are in traditional real estate. Move a Hilton branch and one brand as one lump of cement to another. In plant and machinery, I did a huge litigation in Ireland. They basically, everything, all these radiators, as well-known Barlow Group, were useless without the process patents. IA branding is in the most traditional industry. It's not just modern industry. In fact, it's more in traditional industry than it is in modern industry. And this is another problem that bankers just don't understand. They see a lump of cement, but they don't, or a lump of metal, and they don't understand what making this tick is the IA. Sorry, I had to get that one.
Let's try and cover two more questions in 2 minutes if we can.
Yeah.
We're really struggling for time. We've got to move on to the next session just very soon. Obviously, a lot of people are asking questions. If we don't manage to cover your question, please make sure you attend the virtual drink sessions afterwards, and then you can talk directly to the speakers after that as well. And also, heads up, if you want to get your question in for the next session, get your question in as early as possible, and then we're more likely to be able to cover it straight after the presentation. Thanks to Enrico, who asks, what international jurisdictions does this apply? Does this apply to Europe, further beyond? Kelvin, would you like to take that one?
Locations are weird and wonderful. A lot of patent international tax guys with patents would invite Luxembourg. Swiss cantons are very popular because you can do your local deals with the mayors and so forth. In the old days, France was attractive to the Rolling Stones, for example. But no, any jurisdiction. But what I would suggest, and I'm sure Rupert will be focusing on, it's very wise to have one with a good legal jurisdiction. So it's not the exotics anymore, the old days of the BVIs, Aruba I saw in government in the early days. Get away from that. You need a good, high-quality legal jurisdiction. So as well as the structure, there is a good place, not only with Julius's session here, you can go for infringers, you can protect well. So a high-quality legal jurisdiction, but it can be anywhere, from Far East, Singapore to Switzerland to Ireland to Luxembourg and to wherever. Great
stuff. And to finish off, let's just one more question to Fernando. Fernando, you've described the science of valuation, but there are a whole host of judgments here too. How do you get companies and lenders to buy in to that judgment?
No, that's an excellent question. I think the number one is to actually do the most amount of due diligence as possible and really try to understand where the cash flows are coming from, what the assets are, who owns those assets, how is the structure, is there a company structure, how does the cash flows even be intercompanies, how do they operate? You really have to understand those quite in detail. I mean, there's a lot of subjectivity, of course, but we try to make our best forecasting estimates and stress test. Sometimes we can have different scenarios based on different milestones or different things that the company is willing to do, wanting to do in the future. I think critically, I mean, if I were to talk to brands, one thing that I should mention is people are looking to have a brand they trust. And the thing when you think about a brand is, how does that brand make you feel? So I think that's the premium that you can get with brands, and that really drives things. So that's quite, difficult to look at. But when you look at the numbers and you can see how the marketplace is behaving and giving that premium to that brand in trust and how they feel, I think that's critical for any brand that's going to be forging their way forward.